All right, guys. Hi. So, kind of moving forward from what we talked about last time with autism, right? So, kind of the review here is that the notion of these psychological disorders essentially are that in some way, one way to frame these things is to look at them as deviations from what would be realistic thinking, let's say. So, let's not use the word normal, let's use the word realistic. So, what constitutes realistic thinking? This is said to come from the spleen. So, when the spleen is strong, it produces something that we call the clear yang of the spleen. That clear yang rises into the mind and produces clear thinking. So, things that affect this clear yang rising into the mind process, then it, in some way or another, depending on what the factors are around that, will affect how the psychology is working, will affect how realistic your thinking is. So we talked about, a couple of cases that I had of paranoid schizophrenia, and this is a clear deviation from what we would consider realistic thinking. Right, we were saying there that what's interesting is that the Shen, in a sense, is designed to reach out, or the Hun, the as a portion of the Shen, is designed to kind of reach out and interact with the world around it. But there's limits to the degree that this happens, right? But in schizophrenia, there's some aspect of that where the Shen kind of hyper connects with the world. It takes in too much information, doesn't filter it in a sense properly, because then all of that information is about the individual, but from a paranoia perspective, right? So it's a very interesting complex of symptoms, right? Because that's paranoid schizophrenia. You have process schizophrenia, which is more like kind of manic stuff, large mindedness. Oh, if only I could talk to the president. I have a million ideas how we could solve all of this, and it all seems reasonable in the moment, but that doesn't. But again, it's sort of a self-driven thing. Like, I have these ideas that are correct, and they embody some very large overarching connection to the world, and can affect very large, it speaks to some large process at work, whether it's attacking you or whether you can fix it or whatever the case may be. So this is one kind of deviation from realistic thinking of the clear yang of the spleen, the clear mindedness. We talked about autism when we said, look, like, part of what autism's issue is the social aspect of it, right? These kids are sort of internally driven. They're sort of, in a sense, stuck in the interior and have a hard time reaching out, whether they want to reach out or not, whether they can reach out or not, through sort of socially accepted modes of communication, namely speech, of course, but anything. All of these things being affected. And so, when my autistic patients come in and they've been to a Western doctor, the one thing that a Western doctor sort of has to offer, besides occupational therapy, speech therapy, behavioral therapy of different sorts, is the one thing I hear them sometimes talk about is diet. And it's kind of the one thing that Western medicine, some practitioners of Western medicine have been able to see the research about this and realize that pretty much across the board in my patient base, 100% of my autistic kids need to go on a gluten-free and casein-free diet. I mean, it just goes, it's kind of a non-negotiable for them ultimately. Whether they get to it right away or not, I might give them some leeway and just be like, hey, look, we don't need to start that right away. I'm not trying to ruin your life right now, make everything in your life hard. Let's see what we can do given the fact that they are eating this and that. But eventually we need to start to think about strategizing how we might do this. This is you can imagine how you could strategize this kind of stuff. But what's interesting there is that for us, in a sense, what we talked about last time is saying, look, like, this is a phlegm problem, a phlegm sort of misting the mind, causing the Shen to be stuck in the interior, causing there to be a lot of heat rising into the mind, making it difficult for them to interact with the outside world, but also driving their internal space. Their minds are very active, but stuck in the interior. So there's this kind of Shen stagnation, qi stagnation, rising heat, all of these things kind of happening at the same time. But I chose to present it through the lens of kind of this social aspect of it, right? But there's a number of different issues that need to be addressed here. But what's interesting to me is that the doctors, the one thing that they have that sort of sits outside their normal wheelhouse is diet, for in this case, that they did kind of figure that out, not only as a risk factor, but as a viable sort of quote unquote treatment option, lifestyle adjustment that can be made. And so, we know this, anyone who's paying attention to wheat, we know that the gluten levels in standardized wheat have increased in the United States by, I don't know, 100-fold or something like that. I mean, just to make it chewier and yummier. So this gluten factor in the bread is dampening, and there's no question here that American bread, and not all of you are in the United States, I know. I've heard from some of you from various places, and there's no doubt that the bread in America is quite different from what you guys get in other parts of the world. Like, I have a number of patients who, for example, are Europe. This has happened to me so many times. I'll have European patients who move to the United States and suddenly have bread issues, kids. I'll have kids who have bread issues here, wheat issues here, gluten issues, that are from here, live here, have gluten issues, can't eat it, and then they go to Europe and they can eat the cheapest bread off the shelf in Europe with all kinds of crummy stuff in it that just sounds kind of crummy, but they eat it and they're fine. And so it definitely tells you something, and this has happened to me innumerable times. This is not just a coincidence, it's a thing. And so same goes with casein for these autistic kids. So the question arises then, this notion of food allergies, food intolerances, and the like. How am I sort of dealing with this? What's my thought process about it? And you're going to have to forgive me if I already talked about this. I have no idea what. In a sense, I don't quite remember what I've said in this format previously. But my view on food allergies is pretty basic. So from a Chinese medicine perspective, well, let's start from an integrative perspective. Essentially what's happening is these gluten and casein proteins, they're proteins, right? And they're complex proteins. And they're a good source of proteins, but they're complex. A casein protein is going to be far more complex than, say, like a meat protein. Far more complex. And a complex protein means that it's built up from amino acids. And the way that your body deals with that is to break down the bonds between each individual amino acid. And that requires an H2O and all that stuff. That's why you need to drink more water if you eat a lot of meat and stuff. But if the digestion is somehow not as strong as it could be, or if the diet is just so rich in these proteins that it's just kind of overwhelming to the system, what you end up getting is a digestive system that has trouble breaking those proteins down completely. And so what's supposed to happen is your body breaks down those proteins, and then each individual amino acid is quite small, and it gets out into the bloodstream through the intestines, right? Then some of those individual amino acids go straight to the organs to be utilized, to the muscles to be utilized, and a lot of them end up in the liver, where the liver does its awesome thing where it recombines them into stuff your body needs. Quite an amazing process. And that's how the body's supposed to work, right? These individual amino acids get out into the bloodstream and are usable by the body. But what happens is when the digestion isn't quite as strong as it could be, you'll often end up getting a lot of half-digested sort of casein proteins and gluten proteins, these complex amino acid structures getting out into the bloodstream via the so-called leaky gut phenomenon, which is an inflammatory response where when the intestines are inflamed, like these little holes appear. And this is well documented in Western medicine, even if the doctors don't follow this. The phenomenon is well documented. So this doesn't qualify as like woo-woo weird medicine. This is well understood that this leaky gut phenomenon is a real thing. Now, what it's doing and all of the different aspects of it and the complexities of it are less agreed upon. But one aspect of this is that when those leaky gut, when that leaky gut phenomenon is occurring, then those half digested proteins, which aren't supposed to be getting to the bloodstream, start going through those holes and they get into the bloodstream. Because normally, if there's no inflammation in the gut, there's no holes, and there's no holes big enough for those half digested proteins to get out into the bloodstream. The amino acids individually are small enough, but a large chain protein like that shouldn't be able to get through, but they do now. Now, here's where the problem arises, is that your immune system is not about to deal with that. It doesn't like that, right? So what I have heard that the general thinking is that your body sort of responds to those half digested casein and gluten proteins in the bloodstream, responds to them as if they're viral protein packs, because that's essentially what a virus is, just a conglomeration of some proteins. So your body deals with it like it's a dead virus, and basically just packs it up and sends it out through the orifices. And that's kind of the Chinese medicine thing, right? So dampness in the spleen will end up in the lungs, whether it's in the lung tissue, in the lungs. And then, so I get a lot of kids who are eating really damp foods. And then when they get sick, they get that thick cough because there's this pre-existing dampness, and then it gets activated by that heat in the lungs. Okay, so that's one way this goes. But this is where dampness of the spleen, so I'm equating this situation to these dampening foods, cheese, dairy, these heavier breads and stuff, American bread at the least. And these are dampening foods. That dampness then gets into the bloodstream, so to speak. This is all integrative medicine speech here. Gets into the bloodstream, and then your body responds to that by basically sending it out to the orifices, where it gets packed in another kind of protein, like a mucin or mucus, basically. And that's why a lot of people who you see this a lot in adults, that eat wheat or dairy and stuff, they get stuffy noses, or they get some kind of phlegm response, and that's totally reasonable, because that's how your body's dealing with what it thinks is a virus. You're getting a stuffy nose, a runny nose, whatever the case may be. This is how your body's supposed to deal with these proteins. But in a situation where any number of factors may arise, where there is this pre-existing inflammatory issue, or what we would think of in Chinese medicine maybe as heat. So remember we talked a couple of times ago or whatever about fetal toxins and the nature of vaccines and fetal toxins and all that jazz. This would be, at least in kids and ultimately in adults, as we talked about, a source of heat that the adults may not even know about. And they're activating that heat, in a sense, by putting dampness into the system. When you put dampness and heat together, they love to interact with each other, right? You create all kinds of little problems and stuff, possibly big problems. So what you want to have happen is you just want your body to get rid of it through the orifices. So kids can build up fluid in the ears around all this, and you get predisposed to ear infections, or they just got a lot of boogers or chronic stuffy noses and stuff like that. These are all at least possibly related to diet, right? So, but in the case, for example, where people have a more systemic inflammatory response, so this is sort of the next phase of the immune system's response. You want it to just pack it up, send it through your orifices, and be done with it. But if it's overwhelmed, or if there's this pre-existing heat source, there's some kind of inflammatory issue in the body, some kind of pre-existing inflammatory issue, then the person is going to have an inflammatory response. So these are people who are getting skin issues. For example, they're getting skin issues around the presence of these proteins. This is ultimately could be like anaphylaxis, essentially an inflammatory response, like kind of rising heat response, getting into the throat and stuff like that, over the peanut proteins or whatever it is. Some people will have the effect of, when they eat wheat or dairy, they get kind of fuzzy-headed. They have trouble thinking clearly. Right? Their brain kind of slows down. All the permutations around all of that kind of mental experience that people often have around this, that in Chinese medicine is phlegm in the mind, in a sense. What's happening there is you're putting dampness into your body. It's interacting with heat. The heat carries that dampness upwards, but this time into the mind. It's not getting vented out through the skin as eczema. Instead, for whatever reason, in particular people, it's rising into the mind. Right? So in some sense, people are inducing, some, not autism, but, something akin to that in some way. I don't know. But essentially what's happening there is people are having a brain inflammatory response. So some people are having skin inflammatory responses. Some people are having joint inflammatory responses. Some people are having brain inflammatory responses. Now, why the brain inflammatory response? Why is this? I forget if we talked about this before, but is this some kind of gene deficiency issue? Is the blood-brain barrier, the thing that protects the brain from these proteins, that protects the brain from inflammatory responses and the like, is that somehow not functioning correctly? These are all questions, right? So then those proteins can pass through into the brain tissue. These are all, again, questions that I don't have answers to, but this would be the logical thinking process to my mind. So that's where then, when we're talking about autism, this becomes so important. That's why these kids invariably, I think pretty much 100% of the time, need to go on these diets. They just ultimately, that's just your new life now. It's just what it is. And they just can't have it and they can't touch it. It's just what it is. They are so pro-inflammatory, and for whatever reason, that phlegm tends to get into their minds. They're just predisposed to this for, again, the number of reasons. We talked last time about all the risk factors and stuff. These are all part of this, right? So the thing to do here, the way that I deal with food allergies in kids is what we say is food allergies, casein intolerance. Most people who think they're lactose intolerant are really they're just having protein intolerances. It doesn't matter. What I do though is rather than just saying to the parent, hey, look, your kid can never have cheese again, and they're like, what am I going to feed my kid? I don't know. What I do is I put them on the 2-week test. So I say, okay, look, here's the thing. It takes about 4 or 5 days to clear those proteins out of your child's bloodstream. I just tell them the story I just told you about how this works in Western medicine, about errant proteins in the bloodstream and leaky guts and all these things. I say, look, it takes about 4 or 5 days for the majority of the actual proteins to clear the bloodstream, although the effects can linger for so much longer. But within 4 or 5 days, the majority of it's clear. And by 2 weeks, most of the effect of that will be mostly gone. Of course, there's always those kids, there's always those adults who just, the effect is longer and stronger and all that. But for by and large, 2 weeks is a good amount of time to clear the side effects of the presence of those proteins. So you give it 2 weeks. That's nice because it puts a limit on how much time the parents are going to have to avoid a food because it's tough for the kids and da-da-da-da-da. Then see how the kid is after 2 weeks. Do you notice a change? Are things different? If not, then reintroduce. Oftentimes, the parent will be like, yeah, after 2 weeks, I guess it's a little better. And then when they reintroduce the food suddenly, whoa, they suddenly realize, wow, there was a big, an improvement that we didn't really recognize as an improvement, because now that we've reintroduced the foods after 2 weeks, it's a problem. If they reintroduce the food after 2 weeks and it's the same, no change in anything, then I'm almost kind of inclined to just be like, look, then that food's not necessarily a problem per se. Because for us in Chinese medicine, there's no such thing, in a sense, as invisible disease. The proof is in the pudding. Either the kid is having a problem with it or they're not. There's a lot of this pseudo-medicine, Western functional medicine thing where there's all these invisible diseases and parasites, this and that, and and it's doing all this stuff to you, that it's affecting your telomeres. It's like, dude, that's not doing it for me. Chinese medicine is a very practical medicine. Either you can see it with your eyes, you hear it from the patient, you can hear it you can smell it, you can see it, whatever it is, the proof is in the pudding. in Chinese medicine. If a thing is happening, you will see it. Now, things can be subtle, that's for sure. So that's where we might bridge that gap from these invisible things that all these Western pseudoscience people are chasing after. You know, a lot of acupuncturists among you guys, among us, you know, in that realm, in that regard, chiropractors and the like. So we might bridge that gap by talking about subtle effects and these kinds of things. But what I'm arguing here is that you should be able to see exactly what's going on, right? So after 2 weeks, they reintroduce the evidence will be there. Either the kid will have gotten better after 2 weeks, or they'll go off the rails after 2 weeks. So what I usually do is I usually pick dairy or wheat, whichever one seems bigger in their diet. I'll pick that one, do that one for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, reintroduce. If that's not it, try something else. Let's try wheat next. Or maybe they want to do both. If they want to do both wheat and dairy, just no wheat and dairy for 2 weeks, then they still need to reintroduce one at a time. Kind of do it scientifically so we learn something. Because maybe wheat's a problem, but dairy's not, right? So who knows? So I'll have them do it that way, because putting a time limit on it is way less overwhelming for the parent and for the kid ultimately. It's easier. Then the beauty of it is if the parent sees the change, then now they are internally motivated to make it happen, and suddenly it's not a chore. It's something they're happy to do. So it works. This system kind of works really well with kids. So what do you have? Like dairy and wheat are by far the first two. Then you start getting into eggs and soy and corn and nightshades and even strawberries. And, the list goes on and on and on. I probably missed some big ones, but that's how I run this as far as kids are concerned, as far, especially my autistic kids. So that question, somebody emailed me a little bit ago asking that question about what's up with food allergies in this situation. And what it is, it's amazing that what I'm sort of arguing here is that autism is a disease of the spleen. We're saying that this is phlegm misting the mind. The fact that it's phlegm tells us that you have to treat the spleen. Whatever else is going on, the spleen is at the core of the process when we're talking about phlegm. Right. This is how it works. And on top of that, we're saying, like, look, this is a psychological disorder, and psychological disorders, we're used to thinking of them as strictly a Shen question. But remember that the Shen is really just an outgrowth of all the other organs, in a sense. Right? It's like the heart doesn't, in a sense, get disease on its own. It gets disease from other places. Right? So in this case, we're kind of making this general argument that a big portion of this is from the spleen aspect, that spleen seems to sit in the middle of autism. So anyways, that's how I'm dealing with food allergies. This question arose. Thinking about this clear yang of the spleen question, though, it brings up something that I hadn't thought about in a little bit, which is depression. It's not my intention here to break down all of the things that I'm thinking about with depression, but in regards to this clear yang of the spleen, we would argue that depression is, again, here, a unrealistic thinking about the nature of reality. Let's say it that way. When you're in it, it feels very, real. It feels, the sort of negativity, cynicality, the sort of hopelessness of it. It's debilitating. Let's make no mistake about it. How hard that mindset is to carry, how hard it is to carry that burden of the world. It's a difficult thing. And, but from the Chinese medicine perspective, that we would say that depression represents unrealistic thinking about the nature of reality. Big reality, small reality, your family situation, the state of the world, and whatever. So, again, here, in a sense, one way to think about depression is usually when you talk to practitioners, and you talk to somewhat less experienced practitioners and you talk about depression, they always say, oh, it's liver qi stagnation, right? Liver qi stagnation. But in a sense, just saying that it's liver qi stagnation doesn't sort of tell me anything. So what about liver qi stagnation? What's it doing? I thought liver qi stagnation was supposed to make you irritable. So where is depression fitting into this? right? And then I've never really heard a satisfactory explanation of that. It just sort of the term just gets thrown out there, but it doesn't get the pathomechanisms don't get described. With irritability, it's easy. Chi is stagnating, heat is rising, da, 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 da. But depression, this is less clear. I mean, we do talk about things like, what about when there is a preponderance of deficiency of the liver rather than excess of the liver, right? So deficiency of the liver starts to look like insecurity, starts to look like lack of self-confidence, like, a lack of sense of the individual self in relation to the world from a social perspective, right? This would tend to be sort of the deficiency aspect of liver. Whereas the liver stagnation is sort of the attempt to control that situation, kind of take control of that situation, or at least to be frustrated about that situation, or however you want to think about it, you get cute about it. But this notion of liver qi stagnation, we think about it a lot. It's a problem that we see in the West. It's a much bigger problem in the West than you tend to see in China, for example. Is not even necessarily considered all that common traditionally in China, although in modern times they say more. But in America, it's something that we kind of obsess about, and I think it's not illegitimate. It does exist for us, because of it's sort of stressful. But this notion of the question of depression. So the way that I was taught to think about this aspect of depression is that depression by itself is not chi stagnation is a possible aspect of depression, but not the only one. That really depression is a very, very clear example of the failure of the clear yang of the spleen to rise into the mind. So when you talk about autism, we're not even really arguing in a sense that the clear yang of the spleen isn't rising into the mind. It's there. It's getting there, but it's being hampered in some way by phlegm. It's being affected in some way by phlegm, by heat, and that combination of phlegm and heat is a problem. Same with schizophrenia. The clarity is there, but it's not realistic clarity. Depression is an interesting one because there is a certain clarity, but it's not a clarity of thinking process necessarily. I mean, there is a clarity to it, but the way it was described to me is that depression is sort of the quintessential example of the clear yang of the spleen failing to rise into the mind, just simply failing to arrive there in a sense. And so in that case, it was proposed to me that that's sort of the way to think about depression. So then when you start to think about liver qi stagnation, what liver qi stagnation is then doing is blocking the clear yang of the spleen from rising into the mind. Now, this presents a more functional and kind of practical way to look at the nature of depression. So that liver qi stagnation just becomes a possible factor. Dampness becomes another possible factor. Qi deficiency, yang deficiency, ultimately blood deficiency, these all become factors that play into depression. And when you think about depression as the failure of the clear yang to rise into the mind, suddenly, then you have at your fingertips a million ways to think about depression. You're not just stuck going like, oh, it's all liver qi stagnation. No, it's not all liver qi stagnation. That being said, it often is hugely, liver qi stagnation is a big part of it. But you have to make that mental leap to realize that liver qi stagnation by itself is not an explanation of the phenomenon. It doesn't explain why their brain is working the way that it is. But when you add this clear yang of the spleen factor to the conversation, now suddenly many, many things start to make sense. Many possibilities as far as these different things start to make sense. That's why exercise is so useful in depression for decreasing its debilitating factors there, decreasing its intensity. And one way to think about that is, movement. Movement does two things. It helps to regulate qi. I think I've said this in this podcast before, but how does it regulate qi? That's a nice thing to say, but again, you're sort of stuck without an explanation. Like movement, yeah, okay, qi, or moving qi, it's moving, but why is it moving liver qi? Just through movement. Yeah, okay, that's actually not the worst explanation of it, but you could do one better by saying that walking increases respiration. more than that, like jogging, whatever you're doing, just any kind of movement will increase respiration. Remember that the lungs are the engine that push chi around the channels, the same way that the heart is just a pump pushing blood through the vessels in a very simple sense. In Chinese medicine, the lungs, in that sense, are also a very simple machine for pushing chi around the channels. That's why breathing, regulated breathing, is so important, right? And we always, it's the litany, breathing, this and that. Breathing regulates the chi. It sets the rhythm that the chi can move by. So that's why you can go for a jog and come back feeling more perspective about an argument, because you moved the chi by increasing ventilation, right? So this is the method. This is the sort of the mechanism by which this works. Now, the secondary mechanism or whatever is that, remember that the sea of chi, the channels that really govern the sea of chi are in the legs. And so by moving the legs, then that increases spleen circulation, stomach circulation, increases the yang of the spleen. That's why it's so important in Chinese culture and Asian culture to do some amount of walking after eating. You see this very commonly. After eating, just even a short walk, and we see this in Western medicine, that just a short walk really changes your body's whole metabolism, changes the way your digestion works, changes your blood sugar, it changes everything. Just doing just a very light walk, just a short constitutional after meals, this is a big deal, right? So this might be two reasonings, the lungs and the sea of chi moving in the legs. The legs are like the pump for the digestion. Where you see this is like you get issues with kids with weak legs. Where you also see this is in geriatrics. God, I'm sure I'm said this already, so forgive me if I start repeating myself at this point in this series of podcast episodes. You see this in geriatrics, where people can be very clear-minded, very strong, generally seem very healthy, and yet their legs are just not working. Very weak legs, and they don't want to walk and all that. And that's a spleen issue in geriatrics. You strengthen their spleen, and the legs start to get stronger. They start actually putting on more leg muscle. They start getting, healthier, more energy. Their legs get stronger. You strengthen their digestion. As an aside, again, forgive me if I'm repeating myself. You see this, the legs, especially the hips in geriatrics. The hips go to the spleen, same way that the knees go to the kidneys. The hips go to the spleen. Shoulders go to the liver, and the neck goes to the lungs. The hips go to the spleen, and if a geriatric patient breaks their hip, the mortality rate on that is like the 5-year mortality rate on a broken hip in an elderly person is horrifying. It's really bad. They're dead within 5 years at a 99% rate. I forget what the numbers are, but it's really high. You can, I'm sure of it. I mean, I've done it. Is you can, if an older person breaks their hip, you have to strengthen their spleen as part of the healing process, and I believe they will overcome that mortality. They will not be a statistic in this. I think they heal faster. They recover fully. They get everything is better, but you really focus on the spleen. A lot of people will focus on the kidneys because it's a bone. They might focus on the liver because it's a joint, but you focus on the spleen. You strengthen their spleen chi, man, that's what heals that hip up quick. You see this in babies like, what do they call it? Hip dysplasia, where the hip bone is popping out of the hip joint there because it's a fairly shallow joint. It always points to spleen deficiency when a baby has hip dysplasia. It always points to spleen deficiency. So you treat that spleen deficiency as the core of the treatment. Then you do lots and lots of local stimulation to kind of draw the spleen chi into that area. So for those babies, I like to put them on herbs, and I like to do lots of local stimulation. You know what they can do is buy one of those sticky pads on the Amazon. They can buy the sticky pads, the little like those little TENS units, the little e-stim with it. You can just buy that, and you can just put that on the baby like for 10 minutes and do it 3-4 times a day. And if you do that, It works by itself a lot of the times, but if you add some kind of spleen tonic to that, it works like 10 times better. I've seen this many times. And you can get rid of hip dysplasia pretty easily. So, anyways, that question of food allergies, but that's how I'm thinking about that. Another question did arise. I got a separate email where somebody wanted me to talk about vaccines a little more. I'm not, I have to be honest, I don't keep up with the Western side of things much, but I do have some things to say. So the way that I talked about it last time was I was sort of saying, like, look, like, this is how I deal with it sort of professionally. Like, look, if you're going to vaccinate your kids, but you're a little worried about it, I have things to help you with that. Sure way Baidu-san and, strengthening chi and blah, blah, blah. And if you're not going to be vaccinating your kids, then to the degree that it's possible, I'll be around to help with any diseases that may arise, measles, chickenpox, whooping cough, RSV, these kinds of things that they, flu or whatever, that they could be vaccinating against that they're not. To the degree that it's possible, I'll be around. I can help you with that. Okay. That's kind of my professional thing. Then the question arises, well, but what's your personal opinion about this? And in a way, I'm not pro or anti-vaccine, which, you know how the world is. Everything's a bit polarized right now. So everybody kind of comes down on either side. Look, either you're totally pro or you're totally anti. And if you're one or the other, you should be drawn and quartered and tarred and feathered and all that. But I'm kind of both. Like, I'm totally pro-vaccine, but I'm just not sure that we're doing it right. That's probably what I would say. Let me give you an example here. In China, in pre-modern China, there are written accounts as early as 1500s, and there's actually apparently some oral accounts from some mentions of this as early as the 1100s in China about inoculating, using immunizations, vaccines of a sort for smallpox. And you get these very complex descriptions of the lesions of smallpox lesions, that if somebody has smallpox, you wait for the lesions to look a very specific way. Like, is it dried and crusty, is a little wet and crusty? They wait for it to look a very certain way, and then the doctor will harvest these, I think they call them meow or something like that. I forget what the Chinese word is for this. They harvest the lesions, and then they take it and they put it on a little piece of cotton, and then you put that into a kid's nose, into another adult's nose, and kind of leave it in there so it can soak into their nasal mucosa and get into their system. And this was considered a style of vaccination / immunization that was done in China as early as the 1100s, definitely by the 1500s. And this was normal. I mean, there were very, very complex descriptions of how to do it, when to do it, who to do it to. I mean, this was not just a by the way thing. This was a thing. So we have a historical context in Chinese medicine for immunizations. And I would argue that in, the arguments on either side aside, it strikes me as a fine idea. If the Chinese, at that time were doing it with a good success rate, it strikes me as a good idea. I'm not against it. But I do take a little bit of issue, at least in the United States, with how we do it here. And there's two factors, I think, that just sort of give me a little bit of pause about it. The first thing is what we call the density of the schedule. And there's very interesting research showing, good research, I'm told. I've shown it to a number of people, doctors and researchers, and I've been told that it's good research. But and if you want it, shoot me an email. I'll send you a link to I have the study in hand. That the higher the vaccination density, essentially, the more you vaccinate a kid, the higher the infant mortality rate goes. Because what they were attempting to do was to figure out, why does the United States have such a high infant mortality rate among developed nations? We have, I think, the highest infant mortality rate among developed nations, despite the fact that we spend so much money on healthcare and we're, supposed to be awesome and all that. And yet, our children die at a much higher rate than in other countries, developed countries. And why should this be? This research actually figured out that it's the density of the vaccine schedule. The headline, the more you vaccinate a kid, a baby, the more likely they are to die. It's pretty simple. So that's the first thing that gives me pause because, and this is not conspiracy theory stuff. I mean, this is just how it works. The density of the vaccine schedule is not something being pushed generally by like a bunch of intelligent doctors who all get together and decide what's good and not good for society. This is entirely driven by the industry. The industry money drives this entire system. And again, this is not conspiracy theory. I am the least conspiracy theory oriented person out there. It's not a conspiracy. It's just how it works. This is just how it's done. The companies want this stuff pushed through. They push it through, man. Many, 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 many examples of this. So the thing is like for me, I'm not totally sure that pharmaceutical corporations have my individual child's best interest at heart. You know what I mean? It strikes me as a reasonable idea. I don't feel like I'm unreasonable for thinking that that might be the case. That's just me, you know? So that's the first thing for me about vaccines. I'm convinced that maybe we're just doing too many. And we've talked about that, right? We talked about the measles. We talked about chicken pox. These are things that kids from a Chinese medicine's perspective are supposed to get, right? We talked about this, I think. If I didn't, send me an email, I'll talk about it. So these are diseases that kids should get, right? So don't blast me with a bunch of emails about, what, vaccinating for. I don't know. I'm just saying that, these are things that kids are supposed to get. And that issue may be solved then by my second complaint about vaccinations, which is I worry a little bit about how we're doing it, which is to say two things, which is to say that we're putting it directly into the bloodstream, which is bypassing all of the normal inflammatory questions, all of the normal ways that the body deals with pathogens. You're bypassing the wei qi. You're just directly going into the blood level, which is affecting qi level stuff. It's affecting the organs. It's affecting very deep structures in the body and leading to problems. The normal side effects that we think of over the long term, which we talked about in vaccinations, are because of the fact probably that we're bypassing the normal routes by which the body gets sick. Now these pathogens have direct access to the organs and do affect them. We know this from a Western and a Chinese medicine perspective. So injecting them into the blood seems like the less reasonable way. It would seem more reasonable, like, for a long time you could get the nasal, where you put the flu vaccine in your nose and you sort of get it from the nasal way. I forget what they call that. I know that it's hard to control the dose, it's hard to all this stuff, but it strikes me as a more reasonable way to do a vaccination, to do an immunization, because it more closely follows the body's natural processes. So if we could figure out a way to introduce vaccines via the mucosal membranes rather than through the blood, that would strike me as a more reasonable way to do vaccines. Okay. The second thing is that I do genuinely worry about the things that are in the vaccines, right? So things that we call adjuvants, which are both, things like aluminum and things like mercury, these, thimerosal and all these things that are there as preservatives, but also there to provoke an immune response. That's not all that's in there. There's some pretty kinky stuff that gets in there, all, designed for different things, but essentially to provoke an immune response is what a lot of it's there for. I'm not here saying that, Wakefield was right and these things are all causing autism. I'm not saying that's the case. I don't know if that's the case or not. What I'm saying is it creeps me out a little bit. I feel like there must be a better way to do that. That's all I would argue. And again, who's in charge of this? The large pharmaceutical corporations. And I understand it makes it easier for delivery. It gets it done because all of these other ways to do it will just be more difficult. I understand all those arguments, but I still don't like it in terms of the individual. Because a corporation or a medical body, like a governmental body, is going to be thinking of the group. How do we best get all of these vaccines delivered to as large a number of people as possible? Let's make it easy to do injectable so you know what the dose is. It's easy to ship around because it's got lots of preservatives in it. So I get it for the group, but for the individual, each individual kid getting the vaccination, I feel like there might be some reasonable arguments here the density of the schedule, the way that we administer the vaccines, and the ingredients that are in the vaccines. I think that that's not an unreasonable position, given that I think vaccines are probably an awesome idea. I'm convinced it's not a bad idea. This is a great idea, fine. But do we need to do so many, and are they clean? And are we doing them the right way? These would be my arguments, over and above what all the Western medicine stuff, the anti-vaxxers, the pro-vaxxers. I'm not interested in those studies necessarily. I'm not interested in those arguments. I'm not interested in getting into those arguments. I think that I've carved out for myself a very centrist, middle of the road perspective about all of this that I think when I express it properly, I think is reasonably convincing. I sound reasonable to myself at the least. Okay. Okay. Do vaccinations cause autism? I have no idea. I will tell you this. I mean, from a anecdotal perspective, I have had many parents come to me and say, my kid was totally neurotypical, quote unquote normal. They did a vaccination, and within a day to a few days after that, they had some kind of reaction. And the aftermath of that reaction, they are now considered autistic. I have heard that story many, 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 many times. Now, this is very anecdotal. This is a very small sample size. I can't speak to all of that, but I've heard the story too many times. It's heartbreaking. It's a heartbreaking story to hear, right? So I'm not arguing that it is or it isn't. I think there's an argument to be made there. The Chinese medicine argument, I mean, the Western medicine argument, you guys can make that argument all day. It's fine. I don't know. The Chinese medicine argument is interesting in that what they're arguing there is that a more typical negative response side effect to immunizations would be the presence of lingering pathogens in the body, interacting with pre-existing heat, and lingering pathogens do make more heat, and they do often produce phlegm in the body as well as a side effect of that. As being a lingering pathogen. So then you're getting right at the heart of what autism is. You're talking about phlegm and you're talking about heat. And if there is already some pre-existing genetic predisposition to autism, maybe what we would call a kidney deficiency, maybe that's the perfect storm you need. Because by and large, I mean, a lot of my patients are vaccinated, and not most of them are autistic, right? It's not like all the parents are coming to me saying this. And I'm catching a pretty high percentage of my patient population that's gonna say that stuff. So I know that it's even less than I'm seeing, right? Proportionally. So it's most of the kids are fine, right? So statistically, your kid is gonna be just fine, but there's always those kids that aren't. So what's the factor here? I think it's all of the risk factors we talked about last time. It's the genetic predisposition. It's you sort of just have to get a good, perfect storm of all of those things happening at the same time. And then you introduce the one thing that kind of breaks the camel's back. This may be a way for Chinese medicine to explain, a way for us to explore the notion that a vaccine in theory could be causing autism. Like I said, I've heard the story more times than I would have cared to have heard it. And Chinese medicine does provide at least some rational way to unpack the notion that this is possible. Again, I'm not interested in getting drawn into an argument about whether it is or it isn't happening. This is not what's interesting to me here. What's interesting to me is what's practical. What can we do? How can we prevent such issues from arising, assuming they are happening? These kinds of questions. So hopefully that comes across correctly. I want to thank you guys for sending your questions, because that's what sparks episodes of this nature. It gets me talking about things that I'm not thinking about all the time. So if you guys are out there, I want you to hit me up. Let me know you're out there, and let me know you're enjoying it. And okay, let's talk soon. Okay,